My name is Jeremy Devins of Quietmind.yoga, and bound angle pose, Baddha Konasana, is one of the most important and common yoga hip openers. And we're opening the inner hips here, the adductors. And in this video, I'm going to walk you through how to go from maybe your bound angle pose looks like this, and you're having a hard time opening your hips, to maybe finding a little more length in your spine, a little more opening in the hips. I'm going to walk through poses to build into this, and then progressions beyond this pose, things you can add on to it. Whether you're beginner, intermediate, advanced, I'll give you options for all of these, and I'll show you some of the common mistakes that people make along the way. So you can join along with me and practice, or you can just watch and learn. I'm going to be talking through the whole practice. So it's more information, but also embodiment and in practice as well. So you'll want to have 2 blocks and a belt or a strap or a towel of similar length. If you don't have any of this, I'll give you options to do this without the props. So let's move over to laying on the back, and we'll start there. So what we want to do is be able to open up into this pose more easily and then into advanced versions beyond it. So we're going to start step by step laying on the back. So the first thing you'll do is use your strap or belt and put that around the arch of your right foot. So the main thing that's happening in Baddha Konasana bound angle are the adductors lengthening. So to do that right here, just open your leg out to the right. Now your leg might be a little more at an angle, down away from your body, but as best you can, move your leg in line with the hip. So your right foot's in line with the right hip. And if that doesn't work, just okay to go a little bit lower or straighter from there. But you don't want to lock your knees. You want to micro bend in your knee and your legs opening out to the right. If you don't have a strap or belt, just use your hand under your thigh. You could also use a block under the thigh for a similar effect. And as you can feel here, there's a lengthening between your groin and your knee. Those are the adductor muscles. There's 5 muscles there. And their function is to adduct the leg. And that means squeeze the leg towards the center, which is not the most common movement. And for this reason, many people have weak adductors. And one of the keys to building flexibility and openness in the body is also building strength in the body. And that means adding resistance. So here, if you have your belt around your foot, you've got a way to add resistance and try to lift your leg into adduction. So you're trying to bring your leg back to center, but your hand is resisting. Now, you might feel better if you hold onto the strap, or if you put your hand inside of your thigh and press as you try to squeeze the leg together. And we'll do some variations of that, because when you contract the muscle in this way, it allows the stretch receptors to lengthen the muscle more. And this is one of the keys to understanding flexibility in the body. We don't want to just stretch everything out all the time. That's going to create imbalances and weaknesses, and our body is going to get injured, and we're going to have aches and pains. So we're adding some contraction here, resisting the hand or the strap, holding that, and then we'll let it go, and maybe you're able to open your leg a little bit more. And you've probably heard of this technique called PNF stretching, or Proprioceptive Neuromuscular Feedback. Proprioception is like your awareness of what's happening in your body and around you. Neuromuscular means your mind-muscle connection. And the feedback is giving that resistance. So you're building more mind-muscle connection and then allowing the muscle to open more. So we'll take that belt away on this side and go over to the other side for the same thing. So belt around the arch of the foot, the legs straight up to start. You can have your right knee bent, makes this a bit easier. And open your leg out to the left any amount. So again, it's okay if your leg goes a little bit down towards the bottom of your mat, but in general, you want your foot in line with your hip as you open out. And you don't have to go all the way to the floor. So if you can go further and your right hip starts to pull off the ground, you've gone too far. You don't want that. You want to keep your hips low to the ground and focus on the length between your groin and your knee and not any twisting in the back. So your back stays down, shoulders and neck stay relaxed, and you're lengthening your adductor muscles here, but just one leg at a time. And you're taking your back completely out of the equation, which is really a big key to this pose, which makes it great to set up for bound angle, because a lot of the issues with it is often people have tight backs, and that makes it difficult to sit, and it definitely difficult to sit in bound angle pose. So this is a version of Supta Padangusthasana, or supine hand to foot pose. And if you are more advanced, you could be doing this with your hand holding your big toe and no strap at all. So that's another way to do it. But it's a little harder to add the resistance that way. But either way, now we're going to add this resistance of lifting your leg towards the center, but you're resisting with your hand or the belt. So it's a little tricky here, right? You can't add too much resistance. And really, if I really wanted to, I could just easily bring my leg up and kind of push past the hand. But I'm going to just kind of meet that resistance by not letting the leg overpower it. So there's some contraction happening there in the inner thigh. And now we'll let go of that resistance and maybe open the leg out a little bit more. So you've essentially shortened the muscle fibers, and that makes them feel safe to lengthen. And we'll let this go and take the strap away. Now the next best thing to build up to bound angle here is on the back, doing supine bound angle pose. So you'll want your 2 blocks for this. And the blocks can be at the lower, middle, or highest height. If you're more tight here, start with the middle height really close into your thigh. That's going to increase the angle of the legs. Feet are together, knees are apart. So the soles of the feet touching, knees are apart. Now, if you're more open here, move the blocks out a little wider. If you're still more open, this is not a big deal for you. You come down to the lower height of the blocks. And if that's okay, and there's no issue here, take away the blocks. Now, if you don't have blocks, use your hands as fists right in next to your hip. So the tighter you are, the closer into the hip. And if you're a little more open, a little bit further away. But the key is here, you want to feel some lengthening of the inner hips, but you don't want to feel like it's pulling and it's going to hurt and you're going to have pain tomorrow. That's too much. So in general, we want to stay around 60 to 80% of your range of motion. Anything beyond that is going to essentially tell your body that you need to tense up and resist and protect yourself more. And you're not going to become more flexible. You're actually going to become more tense and likely have more imbalances. So stay in that 60 to 80% range where you can easily breathe. Taking slow, deep breaths is really important in this work. And then here we can add some resistance again by having the hands on the thighs and trying to adduct the legs, squeeze the legs together. Now I'm only focusing on the adductors in this particular video, but there are other videos I'm making that will address all of the hips. You want to make sure you're working with all of the hips, but if this is a particular pose you're wanting to work on, that's all we're focusing on in this video. Now, if you have a block nearby, you can use the blocks between the thighs and press that into the legs, and it gives you a little more resistance to work with. If your legs tremble and shake a little bit, that's normal. How often do you strengthen your adductors? Unless you're doing specific exercises at the gym or something, it's pretty uncommon, especially in yoga, it's very uncommon. So we've got to find ways to do that here because our goal is not just to be a pretzel and contortionist. Our goal is to have full awareness and connection to the body and able to strengthen and stretch and find balance in the whole body. That is what ultimately allows the mind to be clear and enter a state of deep meditation and presence of yoga. Now we'll take away that resistance and let your knees open apart. And maybe they feel a little more open, maybe not. Notice what feels right for you. But typically you'll feel a little release of tension and a little more flexibility in the legs. So that's addressed the adductors, the main part of bound angle pose. Let's bring the knees back together, and now we'll address the back, the other big part of bound angle pose. So your pelvis can be in a posterior pelvic tilt or an anterior pelvic tilt, arching. That's where you could slide your hand under your back. Posterior pelvic tilt, rounding the low back, it's kind of tilting the pelvis in, and anterior pelvic tilt, arching the back, slightly tilting the pelvis away. So let's bring the hands on the knees for Apanasana. This is an exhale to bring your knees in, and an inhale to press your knees away, arching your back. So do that a couple times. Exhale in, and inhale away. So you want to be aware of your pelvic tilt in every yoga pose. It's very important, especially seated and standing. But here, just moving with the breath a couple times, bringing some awareness there. And now let your feet down to the floor, and we'll just come up to sitting. So you can rock forward and back or roll over to your side, and we'll come into a seated posture here. So from the side, you can see that my pelvis can again go into a posterior pelvic tilt, rounding the back, or an anterior pelvic tilt, arching the back. So that's the spine and the pelvis working together to do that. But the common issue here is you might have a more posterior pelvic tilt and more rounding in your back. So it's going to be difficult to go into bound angle pose with that. So we want to use our props, either a block or a blanket under your tail. Now, the more tense you are here, the more height you want. And as one of my teachers would say, every year he adds another blanket as his body gets stiffer. So you can sit up on one blanket or multiple blankets or a yoga block or something of that same height. So I'm going to demonstrate with a block. And I worked with an older gentleman who had severe injuries early on in life and limited mobility. And just sitting for him looked more like, well, actually he used 2 blocks. So this might be you, and that's okay. Or if you know someone like this, it's totally okay, because that's going to bring the hips higher than the knees. And then in his case, we were just working with sitting cross-legged and not bound angle, so not stretching the adductors. So if you have difficulty sitting, you might just work on sitting up tall, finding that arch of your back, the anterior pelvic tilt, and even exaggerating a little bit, leaning forward, just to get the hips above the knees to get into that part of the pose. Now, for most of us, though, most people I encounter, you don't need to sit quite as high, but you can sit up on one block, or in my case, I'm going to use the blanket rolled up a little thicker. And feet together, knees apart, and use the blocks here. So again, middle height, close into the legs, makes this less intense, and just focus on the pelvic tilt. And it might be today, you just go 1 degree into that arching of the back. Now, it's not like a huge exaggerated arch back bend. It's just a little more neutral, and then maybe 5 degrees of a anterior pelvic tilt here. Again, if you go to the posterior pelvic tilt, that's just going to curl everything in, and we're not going to be able to lengthen the adductors there. So extend the spine, lift your heart, slightly arch your back, and let your knees open apart with your feet together. Now, if you feel open here, move your blocks out a little wider, maybe down to a lower height. And over time, maybe no blocks. And if you need to scoot your feet a little forward, that works too. Extend your spine, lift your heart. And maybe you don't need a blanket and you just take that away. So that's the progression over time as it gets easier. And again, it's just regular practice with everything in yoga. You do a little bit each day, stay around your 60 to 80% edge, and it'll slowly expand over time. We don't want to try to get to 100% today because that's just probably going to make your muscles tighten up more and resist. So long spine. Then if you're more advanced and you're more open here, you might start to extend your spine and hinge at your hip flexors. So you shorten the hip flexors, keeping a long spine as far as you can. And then maybe you can round your back and maybe even bring your head to your feet, forehead to the feet. So it's just repetition and practice. I was a very tight young lad in high school and I could barely touch my toes. But with regular yoga practice, you get more open and advanced over time. But don't force it. Just meet your body where it's at today. Do what you can for today. But eventually you might progress into that version of bound angle. And even beyond that, which is what my girlfriend can do, is stuff with legs behind your head and going even further. But that's beyond the scope of this video and my practice. So I'm just going to stay here for a moment. And then start to come back up. Now this allows, over time, as this becomes safe and sustainable, and you can easily stay in that version without the props, now you can go into things like Bakasana frog pose, which is also an adductor stretch. Now, before we do that though, we can add a little resistance here. So wherever you're at, use a little resistance to, again, contract the adductors. The adductors add to the center when your knees come together. So you can use your hands here, your forearms, to add a little resistance and squeeze together. And I'll show you one more way that's even more effective than this, is you take one of your blocks or a blanket. Sometimes the blanket's actually more effective for this. And come down to your back again to squeeze your legs together, adducting the legs. And use the blanket or your hands, palms facing each other, or a block in the middle height, probably, squeezing together. This is going to contract even more in the adductors, and it's going to allow the adductors to be more receptive to progressing from here, where you can use a blanket across your mat for the knees. So we're going to come up to a kneeling position here. And generally you want your blanket wide across, so you've got support and padding there. And you might have a block out nearby ready for this, setting up for a frog. So knees go wider than hips, and your toes are either going to point out, back, or in, depending on your bone structure. None of those are better than the others, just anatomy, right? So wherever your feet feel natural, stay there. And you don't need to bring your knees all the way apart from each other. That's too much. Stay around that 60 to 80% edge. And stay on your hands or come down to elbows on blocks. And maybe down to elbows on the floor. And you can feel as you go further, it's increasing the sensation of stretching your adductors, maybe down to your hands under your head. And over time, maybe a little wider with the knees. Keep your hips in line with your knees, not behind or in front. All right, so this is more intermediate and advanced. Again, you could be taking baby steps in that direction from that wide knee position to start. And over time, you progress further into that. Then we'll slowly start to come out the way you came in. And we'll come back to sitting comfortably on the mat. So that's our little practice with bound angle pose, Baddha Konasana. Again, it's feet together, knees apart. Your adductors are lengthening. Your abductors are contracting your outer hips. Your spine is extended. Your pelvis is not in a posterior tilt, but an anterior tilt. And you can hinge forward over time. And it's okay if you go into spinal flexion eventually, rounding your back to touch your head to your feet, but only if everything else before it feels easy and safe and there's no back pain. If there is, you have all those variations to work with blocks and props. So that's our quick overview of Baddha Konasana, bound angle pose. And if you want to learn yoga step by step from complete beginner, check out quietmind.yoga for the Yoga for Beginners course, which has daily practices that include hip opening and the whole body and addressing the whole body holistically, like I do here. Now, if your inner hips feel really open and now you want to balance things out, go to my video for the outer hips so you can balance that out and also build some strength and flexibility in the outer hips. And of course, if you want to keep going from there, you continue to the hamstrings and the hip flexors. It's good to address the whole circumference of the legs, but this video is just specifically about the inner hips. So if you're enjoying this, please like, comment, and subscribe, and let me know what videos you want to see more of. And thank you for watching the Quiet Mind Yoga YouTube channel.